Sister, we were starting to talk about the daily life at Carmel, and here we are in the former cloister of Carmel. Maybe this would be a good spot to talk about that.
That is, cloister itself is an idea that is kind of unknown to some people or associated with the sound of music. But the cloister is really just the space that's set apart for the nuns. And this, within that space, this little, these hallways that go around the courtyard are what we refer to as the cloister. And that typically is a monastic structure that design that represents kind of the combination of communal life as well as the solitude that's built in, and the building itself is structured to support. Even you mentioned the sayings on the wall, where everything was to cultivate an attentiveness to God and what we refer to as recollection. In a strict way, cloister also is kind of a technical requirement for nuns and monks. It limits the public access to a certain part of the building, and it also kind of defines the space where the nuns or monks ordinarily would be living. As cloistered nuns, we lived here all day, every day, unless you were going out to the doctor or something similar to that. But otherwise, the life was intended to be lived as a community, and yet in our tradition, it allowed for, rather than working together very often, for the most part, the ideal was that we should be able to work each one apart so that could preserve a silence and also a recollection. Because work itself, and this is part of the mendicant tradition, part of the monastic tradition, work itself is considered sacred, and it's a creative thing, but it's also to help support the life. As a community, when they first came, they were doing mostly sewing as a way of supporting the community. And much of that sewing was hand done. It was embroidery or something like that, for instance, liturgical embroidery, although there was also some other handwork that was typical of that time. That type of work could actually be done in the cell. It's on another floor. The cells were on another floor. But in the early days, it was typical for the nuns to spend a good part of their day in their cell working. Later on, when we had other responsibilities, for instance, the cook sisters, the sisters who were doing the cooking would need to be in the kitchen for a good part of the day, but then when they were free, they would either ordinarily go to their cell, unless we were involved in other community acts. The day was more or less divided between those times of solitary work and the times of community acts. The core of the life was, the core structure was the liturgy, the divine office, or the office of the hours, the liturgy of the hours. And going back to the early days of the church, that kind of mirrored the Jewish tradition of prayer, where there were prayer times. In monastic tradition, it was there are about 7 prayer times. They juggled a little bit in the reforms after Vatican II. But from the time I've been here, typically what we would do is the first prayer of the day, community prayer of the day, would be at 6 o'clock in Lauds, and the nuns would come in silence to the choir, and we would chant the office. Now, it was a very simple chant, not the elaborate chant that you maybe would get at the Benedictines. That also represents the Carmelite tradition. And we very quickly went to the vernacular after Vatican II, so that our recitation of chant was in English. But in St. Teresa's day, when Latin was still required, and because they didn't have a strong educational tradition, they were not in they were monastic schools at that time, at least Carmel was not. Latin was something that people could learn to recite, but it really was not a prayer language because it really was not understood. So that was kept fairly simple in terms of, they went through those times of prayer, which are the prayer of the church. It consecrates the day and ties in with the Eucharistic liturgy. Here in Carmel, our specific tradition, going back to the time of St. Teresa, involved 2 times of silent prayer that were in community. So after we would complete perhaps a half hour of the chanted prayer of the morning prayer lauds, we would have an hour of silent prayer in the community, in the choir. And unless somebody had a specific duty, for instance, if they needed to help in the infirmary getting someone up and ready for Mass, then they would remain in the choir during that time of prayer. As a community, we would pray. And that usually was kind of a meditation, but in our tradition that was more than it was Lectio Divina in the sense of reading. It was moving into a reflection, meditation on Christ, and then that interior dialogue with God. So that's how we would begin the day. But at the close of that time, there was what began the 3 little hours of prayer during the day. And we say hours of prayer, but actually this one took about 10 to 15 minutes. In the old days, there was a shorter time. There was another time, prime, but with the reform of the liturgy, it began, we would have terce. And that would take us right up close to the time for Mass. So at that point, the sacristan could get ready for Mass. And then the nuns could do the few things that they needed to do just in that short time. Then we would have gather again as a community for Mass. On Sundays, it was pretty much just the community. But on weekdays, the chapel was also open to the public. And we did, it varied from time to time as to how many people, whether it be a dozen, whether it be a handful. Sometimes you'd have more than that. And in recent years, on Saturday, when it was hard to find an 8 o'clock Mass, we sometimes would have maybe 2 dozen. But oftentimes people would just come in to share in that quiet Mass. The nuns would sing, actually not before Vatican II. And before Vatican II, as I mentioned, it was kind of a solid wall. And there were even norms that required that the nuns not be singing during Mass, that they could respond, that it just was not chanted. But that was lifted with the reforms. And very quickly our community, who had some very gifted musicians, moved into chanting, singing, not just Gregorian chant, but also singing. And that has continued to be a part of our life and as a community. After we would be in the at Mass, it would be a sun Mass. In the old days, early days on Park Avenue, the Dominican, we were down the street from St. Louis Bertrand, and the Dominicans were our chaplains. Then when we moved here, kind of by a little quirk, that Bellarmine was our twin foundation almost.
Well, you had Sister Horgan.
That's right.
Monsignor Horgan's sister.
Monsignor Horgan, and that's really the way it got started, is one of our sisters had a brother, Monsignor Horgan, who was the founding president of Bellarmine. And he was right in the neighborhood, and they didn't have anybody else assigned as chaplain, so he unofficially began. And that started kind of a very rich connection between our community and Bellarmine that has been maintained over the years. Family ties have been an important part of those connections, but the ties that we have with friendships as well as with the priests in the diocese. You've had chaplains here. We've had the diocesan priests from Bellarmine, and then later from St. James when Monsignor Horgan moved there. We've had our neighbors, the Passionists, have often helped us out. They were Franciscans, mostly I think connected with Bellarmine originally. Although for our confessors, we had Dominicans, Franciscans, and Passionists at different times. So that has made a good connection with the men religious of the order, of the diocese, archdiocese, as well as in recent years our chaplains have been retired priests of the archdiocese for the most part.
And when Mother Teresa of Calcutta spoke at Bellarmine, she came here and stayed with the sisters.
That's correct. And my understanding on that was that when she needs to say someplace, she tends to look for a carmel. And a lot of that, and her reason on it is that it's very plain and it's very set apart. It's a quiet place with little publicity, and it was a very nice connection. She stayed in the extern quarters when she was here with her companion, Sister Priscilla. They kind of a part of the simplicity of the life is that by the time, with the police escorts when they arrived to pick her up, to take her to Bellarmine, it so happened that one of our old friends who was delivering milk for us, happened to come up and meet her, and he was allowed in. And so she was very happy to meet him. But that was just kind of her simplicity as well. But I think part of what even her attraction, and aside from just her devotion to Saint Therese, who's her patroness, Saint Therese of Lisieux, the Carmelite nun, who's patroness of missions of all things, that her appreciation for the simplicity and the poverty that have remained a part of our life, even with all the complexities that modern life involves, and even the demands that it has made on our life, and adaptations that it's required. That simplicity of life, the familial relationship, that in a beautiful way is reflected in parishes in another way, but can be lived more intensely in the monastic context, especially in a very small monastic community.
And Thomas Merton was another visitor here rather frequently.
That's right. He was especially attracted by Carmelite spirituality. I think that was probably the main draw for him. And he quietly showed up in the chapel. I think he was back on Park Avenue at the time. Just quietly showed up to pray when he was waiting to go to a doctor. He had permission to come. Came several days before they found out who it was. And then he began with our priors at that time, meeting from time to time with Mother Seraphim, and he had a good relationship with her. She was actually a kind of a mentor to him.
And that he would come to this Carmel too sometimes.
Then he came here, and kind of the same arrangement that he was waiting for a ride, but then a friendship got established through that, and then correspondence. That was a time of that friendship has helped Carmel, not just our local Carmel, but his deepening awareness of Carmelite spirituality, the spirituality of prayer, and his ability to popularize that, which can hardly be matched by anyone but by in modern times. I would say he is what Saint Teresa did in her day of just making it, helping people to become aware that prayer is an open invitation, and it's not a specialization, it's not a specific vocation. It's an invitation to people to live their ordinary life in union with God, and his own deepening experience of it and the struggles with it. That as much as it helped open up also kind of broaden the Trappist tradition, open it even to its own tradition in some ways, contemplative, broaden its mode and contribute to the way that they responded to Vatican II. That it has been a big help where in popularizing Carmelite spirituality that has allowed the secular order to grow in recent decades. Really by now it's probably almost 50 years.
I digress. You were talking about an ordinary day. I started talking about your own visitors.
There weren't too many of them. The whole trap stopped in, I think, also when they were in there, but that's about the limit of our imminent visitors.
But we were at the daily mass.
The daily mass, yeah. From there, then there would be kind of a morning time period of work, and then coming together just before lunchtime, basically, which is our main meal of the day. Coming together again for another short time of prayer and a daily period of just a short time of reflection, and what we call the examine. It's time to think about what you've been doing and how you've been doing it, and to kind of refocus a little bit and recenter right at a time when there's a little break in the day. As a community, we would come over. There were processions would come. The cloisters were kind of famous for their processions going back and forth. Sometimes in the old days especially, there would be chanting of psalms during that time, and it was more ceremonial. By the time I came, the processions tended to be in silence, but it was moving as a community. So we had in Carmel, there's that duality of the community life, and yet at the same time that emphasis in a very special way on the solitude and the special call that each one has to a unique life of prayer, a unique relationship with God that contributes to the community, but fostering that time apart, that space apart, was an important part of the structure of the day. After the period of lunch, and this is St. Teresa's kind of innovation, as it were, she thought it was important for a community to gather not only for prayer and not only for the meals. During the mealtime, we would have they would be eaten in silence except for the reading, spiritual reading. In more recent years, we took advantage of media to use taped conferences or lectures or something like that. Occasionally music on feast days, but for the most part it was some kind of a spiritual reading, whether it would be scripture or religious spiritual books. Originally it would be a sister who would do the actual reading, but partly with the smaller community and partly with the availability of taped things, we started, for the most part it was reading. Then we would start doing the cleanup. Again, that domestic part of the life, it's a domestic life here. The housekeeping, the serving, just the ordinary service during the day. Those things were all they weren't just things that had to get done. The idea, if you live your life, doing the things that have to get done, and you never have time for prayer. So what you have to do is just live the life in a prayerful way, so that you have the awareness that what you're doing before God, in God's presence. Even whether you're with community, whether you're on your own, that it still is the presence of God. That special presence where 2 or 3 are gathered, the community presence, but also that call to that oneness with God in prayer that is a more solitary experience. We would gather as a community in the recreation room, which was also set apart as a special place for community, and then we would have an hour of just casual conversation, but it was as a community, and it wasn't games, and ordinarily we would just bring our some kind of small work that we could do while we were talking. Oftentimes it would be sewing or something like that, and mending, things that didn't require a lot of concentration, and then the ideal was that it would be one conversation, not a lot of separate conversations. That met challenges, so people became hard of hearing. But the main challenge became where we really couldn't keep all the bases covered, with getting the work done, with having people there at the same time, by the time you were up in the infirmary and getting you. So in more recent years, especially that midday recreation period, was often just spent free to work out in the garden. And then we could talk while we were there, but sometimes work together. But otherwise, work was ideally done on your own in a special place, depending on what your work was, just so that to allow for more silence while we were working, to allow for more recollection for prayer.
During the chatting time, I hope you didn't end up talking about politics too much.
That, for the most part, even though I was asking her, like for instance, during World War II, or just so we were like on Park Avenue, she said they really